Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 45 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Minnesota Wild and lost by a score of 3-1. Just yesterday, the Sharks really lacked energy and were quite lifeless in their performance against the Utah Hockey Club, very similar to the type of effort they had just a couple of weeks ago, unfortunately enough, on New Year's Eve against the Philadelphia Flyers when they got shut out 4-0. But the good news is that in the very next game after that, going up against a good Tampa Bay Lightning team, they responded quite well with a 2-1 victory. So here tonight, just 24 hours after that Utah game, the Sharks are hoping for a similar level of response against a good Minnesota Wild team. And the deck was very much stacked in favor of San Jose because while normally the Minnesota Wild are a significantly better team on paper than the Sharks, they were very shorthanded here tonight. Not only were they without their best player and also one of the best forwards in the entire league, Kirill Kaprizov, but they were also without their top three defensemen. No Jared Spurgeon, no Jonas Brodin, and no Brock Faber. So the playing field would never be more leveled than it was here tonight. And credit to the Sharks, they did manage to take advantage of this fact. I would say, and I don't think there's much of an argument here, that the Sharks were the better team tonight over these full 60 minutes. And that if you were to play out this game 100 times, the Sharks likely come out on top more often than not. Having said that, there were a couple of things standing in their way. The first of which was, of course, veteran goaltender Marc-Andre Fleury, who was really on his game here tonight and made a bunch of good saves. But the second issue, and that kind of ties into the first one, is that the Sharks did not make this a difficult enough night for Fleury, because while he did have to be good, he didn't necessarily have to be great. The Sharks were very much a quantity over quality type of approach here tonight. A lot of low danger and even some medium danger, but not quite enough of those grade A chances, the types of opportunities that create the goals, of which when you talk about them you say, well, the goaltender just didn't have any sort of chance on that. And Fleury has been around the block many times. When he's seeing these pucks and he is on his game like he was here tonight, he's not going to be letting in many of these goals. And so the one that the Sharks do get by him, that was a type of really strong grade A chance, but there weren't enough of these opportunities. If you look at the other side of the ice, on the other hand, with Minnesota, they were quite shorthanded. They were the worst team here tonight, but they managed to take a quality over quantity type of approach. They could easily go 3, 4, 5+ minutes in a row without so much as a decent chance or even any sort of offensive zone time, but when they did get their looks, when a small mistake was made, or when they had that small opening for themselves, they would be able to get many of these types of elite chances onto Askarov, who was the goaltender here tonight for the Sharks, forcing him to come up with many of these very big saves. And this has been a major issue for the Sharks, not just in this game, but for the entirety of this season, with very few exceptions. There's just simply not enough work being done in the middle of the ice to really challenge the opposing team's goaltender, and you're really instead having to rely on either kind of like really great rush chances or just really great shots from your shooters to consistently beat these goaltenders, which is fine, but not exactly a consistent recipe for success. When it comes to the first period of this game, the Minnesota Wild would have the only goal of the first 20 minutes. This one would come from Rossi on a sort of breakaway, nice backhand chance, and that makes it 1-0 Minnesota. In the second, the Wild would double their lead to make it 2-0 before the Sharks would respond and cut the lead back in half with a goal from William Eklund. That would bring us to the third period, where we really saw what I mentioned earlier on display. There was a particular shift. In the third period of this game, the Sharks were playing in the offensive zone for a good 2 minutes. They actually executed an entire line change while they managed to keep the puck in the offensive zone, but that was pretty much about it. They never truly got to get to the middle of the ice. And so if you're the Minnesota Wild coaching staff in that situation, sure, you're not happy that your team is hemmed in, but you're pretty satisfied that they managed to keep the Sharks entirely to the perimeter throughout this chance. Because if you're just keeping the puck around from point to down to below the goal line, but never actually getting someone in front, never actually getting a close shot through, that is actually not that difficult of a situation for Minnesota, and in particular Fleury, to actually end up handling. And so that's really what ended up being the case here tonight throughout much of this third period especially. And once we got down to those last few minutes, the Sharks could barely even enter the zone, as Minnesota, who is whistling with their top three defensemen but is still a very well-structured team, shut things down, and the Sharks could not find the same openings as they were perhaps earlier on. Eventually, it would be be Matt Zuccarello who adds this goal. This is not technically an empty netter because Askarov was not yet to the bench, but he was still on the ice, so it will not count as an empty netter. It will hurt Askarov's stats, but essentially that was kind of the case, and so the Sharks do end up losing this one 3-1. So while this was an improved effort, they were better here tonight than they were against Utah by far, and that they were against the Vegas Golden Knights as well. It is still a similar result, a regulation loss. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the Sharks' top line, and there were many changes throughout the lineups. Not only were there players returning here on both forward and defense, but as they did have that terrible performance last night, Warsofsky also felt it necessary to really change up the lineup. So I believe every single one of these forward groups is different to the one we saw yesterday. And starting off on the top line, it is Granlund, Zetterlund, and Graf. We did see something like this begin to form near the end of last game, and Warsofsky decides to ride with it throughout the entirety of this one. It did have some good shifts. I would say about 3 to 4 of their shifts were really strong, good offensive zone time, a couple of chances in front. But the problem is that they did not just have 3 or 4 shifts this game. They had like 20 of them, and more often than not, they couldn't really find those same level of chances. And so I'll start off with Mikael Granlund here, who continues to be a player for the Sharks who is not bad. He's very far from being a liability on the ice or even being one of the Sharks' worst players, but he continues to lack that killer instinct that he had near the beginning of this season. He had some good passes. There was one in front for Graf who he just barely missed on. There was one in front for Jake Wallman who pinched down from the blue line. That was actually one of the high danger chances the Sharks did have here tonight. So he's coming close, and it would be nice to see him be able to get on the board, but it just feels as though it is kind of few and far between for Mikael Granlund, when earlier on this season the offense just generally flowed right through him. So you are continuing, and I've said this for many games now, it feels as though a broken record of the last month and a half, you're wanting a little bit more from Granlund. When it comes to his 2 line mates, we do have Colin Graf, and it's kind of been an interesting, debut for him because he did play last season, but I guess season debut over these last few games, because Graf has been put into many positions to succeed. This is not a situation where he gets called up and is immediately thrust into a 3rd or 4th line role. He's not playing with Delandria and Sturm. He's not playing with Cunnin and Goodrow. He was playing at first with Celebrini and Smith, and now he's getting a chance up with more veteran type of players like Granlund and Zetterlund. And in each and every one of these games, Graf has been solid. You know, he hasn't been a liability either on the ice. You can't be too upset with what you have seen, but at the same time, being put into these positions where you are expecting some level of offensive output, he hasn't really managed to deliver in that area. He had that great primary assist on the William Eklund power play goal a couple of games ago, but in terms of his even strength play, there just hasn't been a lot to get very, very excited about. And so it's the type of thing where you're not like upset with what Graf has done, but with the chances that he has been given, you are looking for, tell me if you've heard this one before, a little bit more. And then when it comes to Fabian Zetterlund, I liked his speed, I liked his effort here tonight. I thought he was all right. It is, again, as with the other 2 players here, a situation where he probably could have been better. He probably could have generated more for San Jose, especially with the amount of zone time that they were able to generate, but I don't think I hated this game for Zetterlund. That does bring us to the Sharks' second line, where we have Celebrini, but he's joined by 2 entirely new line mates, Eklund and Toffoli, the reuniting of the That 70s line. I don't believe we have seen this since like game 1 of the regular season against the St. Louis Blues. Perhaps it has been put together maybe a couple of times before or since then, but it feels as though it has been very rarely seen. And one thing that I will absolutely say is this duo of Celebrini and Eklund was very, very fun to watch here tonight. And the chemistry was pretty much instant because of the fact that these are kind of similar players in a way. Celebrini is one of the most hard-working players on the San Jose Sharks. Of course, also one of the more skilled players that they have, but also the hard work that he puts in is very noticeable. And Eklund is also one of those most hard-working players. And so when you have 2 guys who are really willing to get into it, move their feet, get involved, play along the boards, you're going to lead to some success. And indeed, this was by far the Sharks' best line of the night. It's not particularly close. Celebrini and Eklund were a great duo. They combined for the only goal here for the San Jose Sharks. To start off first with Celebrini, it was a great response game. His last 4 or 5 haven't been his best for sure. He'd slowed down a little bit, and I talked about perhaps needing to get him a little bit less ice time. Warsofsky does not listen to me. He played him a bunch yesterday, and even on the second half of a back-to-back with travel, he plays him a bunch yet again here today, and it works out for the better. Celebrini was, in my opinion, by far the Sharks' best player on the ice. He looked fantastic. He's getting these shots. He's getting these controlled zone entries. Obviously, those last couple of minutes there in the third period, maybe he's trying to do a little bit too much, and it does backfire. He has this giveaway that leads to the Zuccarello empty net goal. But still, you can't be too upset with the level of play he put up here tonight. A very, very big bounce back game for him. And then when it comes to his line mate, William Eklund, I was also very much impressed. I don't necessarily think he was like riding on the coattails of Celebrini. Obviously, he benefited from how great Celebrini was doing and how much open ice that Celebrini was able to create for his team. But it was still a situation where Eklund had to look quite good himself, and he did exactly that. His effort on this goal was actually probably more impressive than what Celebrini had, because he weaves his way into the zone, brings multiple wild players towards him, finds this pass to Celebrini, and then puts this one in on the backhand while kind of reaching for it. Just an absolutely incredible effort on that goal for William Eklund. So, I mentioned that Celebrini was the Sharks' best player by far. Maybe that's not actually being very fair, because Eklund was right up there with him for sure. The thing on this second line, however, that was sort of the odd man out was definitely Tyler Toffoli. Now, this is not to say that Toffoli had a bad game, but while I mentioned that Eklund wasn't really riding off the coattails of Celebrini, Toffoli definitely was riding off the coattails of both of these players. I can understand the kind of niche that Toffoli does fit onto this line. He ends up being the type of guy who can just set up in front and try to put in these chances off of the passes from the good work that both Celebrini and Eklund are able to do along the boards to get him to this puck. But to fit in a little bit more with these two players, I want to see someone on this line who plays with a little bit more speed. Toffoli is probably the slowest player, or at least one of the slowest forwards for the San Jose Sharks in this lineup. He plays a much more patient style of game, which works out sometimes, not always, but sometimes when he's playing with a player like Alex Wenberg, but not so much when he's playing with two of the more kind of high-octane forwards on the Sharks like Celebrini and Eklund. So I don't think this is really a great match as a trio, but considering how good this line was, I don't even know if Warsofsky would bother splitting it up. Personally, I would probably have someone like Zetterlund in this role. That might be the best possible option that the Sharks have out of their healthy players in this situation. But again, it's probably something that remains the same. And I can't say that Toffoli was necessarily bad, but he probably should have been able to bury on at least one or two of the chances he did get. Then we get to the Sharks' third line. And this is where we have a very interesting talking point, because it is Goodrow and Cunnin being joined by Will Smith. Now, I want to say this first of all, that Smith has been getting a lot of flack as of late over these last few games for having not played particularly well, and I don't necessarily disagree, but I don't also think that he deserves to be kind of singled out. I feel as though many of the Sharks forwards, especially from an offensive perspective, had not been particularly useful, going from their veteran players down to their young guys as well. So while Smith might not be an exception to that rule in terms of having played significantly better, he definitely hasn't really played all that much worse, and at the very least he was getting those shots on net. Having said that, here tonight, definitely an exceptionally weak effort from Smith. It's not as bad as he was, let's say, in those first few games of the season for himself, but there were a lot of errors here tonight, so much so that he actually ends up getting benched not only for the rest of the second period, but for the entirety of the third period as well. He ended up with less than 10 minutes of ice time here in this game. And so coming into this one, seeing this lineup, Smith with Cunnin and Goodrow, I was ready to be all up in arms. I had my pitchfork and my torch ready to go to bat for Will Smith and say, why are we playing him with these two, like, no offense talented players? That all of that was something I have said many times over, because this is not the first time that Smith has played with both Goodrow and Cunnin on a line. But I was going to say that if, for instance, Smith just didn't really have much of an impact on this game, didn't really get to generate much offensively, but he was at the very least still just kind of like steady and reliable. But it was far from the case here. There were a lot of these aggressive passes that Smith went for here tonight, and many of them did backfire. There was one where he actually had a good chance with Luke Cunnin right in front. That honestly could have been a primary assist if Luke Luke Cunningham did not miss the net. But, of course, the one that really broke the camel's back was here at the last few minutes of the second period. He gets this puck high up in the Sharks' defensive zone, and he could make the simple play where he just chips this puck out of the zone. Maybe he ends up icing it as well. This is probably the type of play his two line mates, Goodrow and Cunningham, would have made. But Smith perhaps taking some of the words from Warsofsky himself to heart, where Warsofsky has mentioned at times in the past where he wants his team to look more so for plays and not just continuously dump the puck out, because you never generate offense doing that. And so he looks for the move to try and catch a player on his team with some speed out of the zone. Unfortunately for Smith, however, his backhand was way off the mark. The idea was there, the thought was correct, and I didn't hate the move, but again, the poor accuracy on it was something that really bit the Sharks, because it's immediately a giveaway to Minnesota. They generate like a couple of grade A chances off of it, and that was the end of Will Smith's night here. So I'm kind of disappointed that he gets benched for the rest of the game, but at the same time I am somewhat understandable of it, especially since the Sharks were really kind of rolling in that third period. If they were really struggling to generate much of anything, I would say probably get Smith back out there, but it felt as though line after line, the Sharks were actually coming out and putting up a decent enough effort that I'd say it's not the end of the world. But circling back to something that I have brought up multiple times, for instance, just yesterday, or when I was talking about Barclay Goodrow's huge mistake that he made that led to a Nick Bjugstad breakaway in the first period, I had mentioned that if Will Smith had made a mistake like that, he'd be benched for the rest of the game. And we saw that here tonight. While, of course, his one mistake there at the end of the second period was not an isolated incident, he wasn't playing particularly good prior to this, we also saw many mistakes from Barclay Goodrow here tonight. One right at the beginning of the third period where he gives this one away along the wall, leading to a 2-on-1 for Minnesota. And you know what happened to Barclay Goodrow? He's right back out on the ice, because the veteran players don't seem to have that same level of consequence to the play that they make compared to the younger guys. So I don't take much issue necessarily with the benching of Will Smith here tonight. I just wish those consequences were doled out more evenly. Then for the rest of this third line, as I mentioned, I don't think Goodrow was good here tonight. Cunningham was maybe slightly better, very slightly better than Goodrow, but not by much. You could put some blame onto Will Smith for that, because their line mate was not doing particularly good, but at the same time, individually, I didn't really like them either. When it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, however, I was very impressed with what these three players were able to do. This trio of players had a ton of energy in this game. I thought in particular Nico Sturm probably stood out above the other two. His first game back in the lineup after missing the last couple, and he looked really, really strong. Some good offensive zone time and just getting those types of chances. This is the type of line where you're not really expecting those high danger opportunities, and you just want them to be able to play in the offensive zone, get the low to medium danger chances, and just be a positive impact for the team, and that's exactly what they managed to do. Grunstrom and Delangelo, while maybe slightly below Sturm, were still rather solid here, so you have to be appreciative of the effort that you saw from the Sharks' fourth line. Then when it comes to the defense, we have Ceci paired with Jake Wallman. So he finally returns from his sort of mysterious injury. As per usual for the San Jose Sharks, we're never quite clear on what an injury is, or generally the timeline for return, as was the case with Marc-Edouard Vlasic, where it was, he might be back for this road trip, and then a month later he's still not playing. For Wallman, it was he's skating, but is he going to come back? Who knows? Well, tonight he finally does return to the lineup, and we can see that Wallman has not skipped a beat. Right on the first shift of the entire game, he gets this puck and he immediately fires a slap shot towards the net. The slap shot is kind of a dying art in the NHL, but Wallman is single-handedly trying to bring it back, because he fires these ones like nobody's business. Sometimes it's not even a great choice, sometimes it is at the very least, but we did see Wallman manage to make an offensive impact. He has the breakout pass that leads to this William Eklund goal, so he picks up the secondary assist there in his first game back off of injury, and he was just generally a nice offensive boost. Not outstanding, but a nice offensive boost to the San Jose Sharks. And then because of his presence on this pairing, we got to see Cody Ceci kind of settle back into a little bit more of a defensive role. Previously, I talked about how he was really jumping up aggressively in the play, and while he is still definitely willing to do that when it calls for the situation, it's not nearly as often as it had been previously, because he can depend on Wallman to really bring the offense of this pairing. And so Ceci falls back a little bit from a defensive standpoint, and I thought he was all right here tonight. There was like that one really major giveaway, I believe, back in the first period that led to some good pressure for Minnesota and a couple of grade A chances as per usual, but more often than not, I thought CC was at least all right. When it comes to the Sharks' second defensive pairing, we have Ferraro and Liljegren, who I actually appreciated the effort of these two players here in this game. Offensively, I thought they at least tried their best to do some good work in the offensive zone. The reason I say tried their best is because Liljegren has some offensive talent, but Ferraro really doesn't have much. And so you're not expecting the world from these two players when they're up at the blue line. You're not expecting some crazy pass or skating laterally across. You're just kind of expecting some level of competency, and I think we did get that from Ferraro and Liljegren, and defensively I thought they did some pretty decent things here tonight as well, so I was impressed with both of these guys. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, we got to get our answer of who comes out of the lineup for Walman. It was Mukhamadullin, and so it is Thrun who gets bumped down to play with Jan Ruda. Still no Market Board Vlasic now for a third straight game, and I don't know if it's a coincidence, but he came back, he won 2 games against Tampa and New Jersey, and now since he's been out of the lineup as a healthy scratch, the Sharks have lost their last 3. Just coincidence? I don't know. But this was not a great game for either Thrun or Ruda. I would say throughout they had some decent shifts, and mostly because Minnesota just couldn't get a ton of chances for themselves. But there were a couple of these shifts in the defensive zone where they had that defensive zone breakdown, and they did a very, very poor job of actually recovering in those situations. Ruda and Thrun's both natural instinct was just to collapse back to the net. But what ends up happening there is that you leave a lot of players open to be able to get great chances from the slot, to be able to make some moves and while you're hopeful that you'll be able to block those shots or that your goaltender will be able to make those saves, these are not the type of openings that you do want to be just constantly letting, and this happened twice on the ice for both Thrun and Ruda, so not the best game for either of those two players. And then when it comes to the Sharks goaltender Yaroslav Askarov, this was definitely a little bit of a tough game for sure. As Askarov himself has mentioned, when you're not facing a ton of shots, it's difficult to try and keep your focus. And so the fact that Minnesota would go medium-sized periods of time without really getting much on net, and then suddenly a flurry of opportunities, it was definitely not easy for Askarov to deal with. When it came to the goals that he did let in, obviously the Zuccarello one doesn't count, even though it will against his stats, because he's pretty much outside of the net going to pull for the extra attacker. The first goal from Marco Rossi, I also will say he has pretty much no chance on. That type of backhand roof play is just an exceptionally difficult save to make. However, the Boldy one, a little bit of a weak one that you probably would have liked to see Askarov make, and it in a way ends up being the difference maker here tonight. Though I won't go so far as to say that Askarov had a bad night. He certainly gave the Sharks a chance to win, and San Jose, as per usual, offensively have just struggled too much. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday, where they'll be taking on the Detroit Red Wings as they'll be heading on the road for a few games in a row. The Red Wings have been significantly better as of late. Most of the time this season they've been quite bad, but ever since hiring former San Jose Sharks coach Todd McClellan, they've actually been on a bit of a win streak for themselves. However, this is a team that still doesn't necessarily have the best of the best defense, and so we shall see if the Sharks can take advantage. The last time they played against Detroit, it was a Macklin Celebrini overtime game winner that got the Sharks the victory. Can a similar performance be replicated? We shall see. Class dismissed.